In this video, we'll be talking about symmetries on the xy plane. There are three main types of symmetries that we'll go over. A graph on the xy plane may be symmetric with respect to the x-axis, the y-axis, and/or the origin. Let's take a look at some examples of each of these types of symmetries. We say that a graph is symmetric with respect to the x-axis if the x-axis acts as a mirror for our graph, meaning points that show up on one side of the x-axis is reflected onto the other side. An example of a graph with symmetry with respect to the x-axis would look something like this. Any point that we have on one side of the x-axis has a mirror image on the other side of the x-axis. If we take this point here and look across the x-axis, we have its mirror image on the other side. Let's take a look at another example. This time I'll draw a graph on just one side of the x-axis. Now, if my graph is symmetric with respect to the x-axis, I know I have to have a mirror image of this on the other side of the x-axis. So to complete this graph, I would have something that looks like this. We see again that any point that we select here has a mirror image on the other side. A point here, if we look across the x-axis, has a mirror image on the other side. Next, let's look at symmetry with respect to the y-axis. This time, our y-axis acts as a mirror for our graph. Any point that we'll have on one side of the y-axis will be reflected onto the other side. A graph like this has symmetry with respect to the y-axis. A point like this on the right-hand side has a mirror image on the left-hand side of the y-axis. Let's take a look at another example. Suppose that part of my graph looks like this. If I have a graph that's symmetric with respect to the y-axis, I know that I'll have a mirror image of this on the other side of the y-axis. So if our graph is symmetric with respect to the y-axis, it would look something like this. Now, any point that we have on one side of the y-axis has a mirror image on the other side. A point over here, if we look across the y-axis, we see its reflection. Our last type of symmetry that we're going to talk about is symmetry with respect to the origin. This time, the origin acts as a mirror for our graph. For any point on our graph, if we draw a straight line from that point through the origin, we have a reflection on the other side. An example of a graph that has symmetry with respect to the origin looks something like this. For any point that we have on this graph, for example, this point here, if we draw a straight line through the origin, we see a matching point on the other side. If we select another point, say here, draw a straight line through the origin, we see that there's a matching point on the other side. Even up here, take this point, draw a straight line through the origin, we see that there's a reflection on the other side of the origin. Let's look at another example. Suppose that part of our graph looks like this. If our graph is symmetric with respect to the origin, any point that we have so far has a matching point on the other side of the origin. So to complete this graph, we would have something that looks like this. On this graph, if we select any point and draw a straight line through the origin, we see that there's a matching point on the other side. Take a point like here, draw a straight line through the origin, we see that there's a matching point on the other side. So in this video, we've learned about the three types of symmetry. Symmetry with respect to the x-axis, y-axis, and the origin. Now, what we'll want to be able to do is determine whether functions have these symmetries. Because if we can identify their symmetries, we'll be able to draw their graphs more easily. One thing we've learned previously is that functions have graphs that pass the vertical line test, which means that unless the graph of the function is the x-axis itself, it won't have symmetry with respect to the x-axis. From our examples here, it's clear that these graphs will not pass the vertical line test. So for functions, we'll be focusing on symmetry with respect to the y-axis and the origin. And that's what we'll be talking about in our next video.